And we finish up this week's Farmer Rapid Fire like we always do with the sponsor, Pioneer Seeds Canada. And today we're joined by area agronomist for Western Manitoba, Derwyn Hammond. Hey, Derwyn, how's it going?
That's going great. Pleasure to
Yeah.
be here.
Yeah, great to chat with you again. Okay, so we've heard from our farmers on today's show. Definitely a lot of talk about whether it's drought or it's the decline in the markets. There's some belt tightening being talked about. And I don't know if everyone's been working out needs to tighten their belt. I think it's about financial belts. Is that kind of what you've been hearing a lot from your customers?
Yeah, certainly lots of focus. In this area, crops turned out to be, I would say, overall average. We had some late season moisture that helped us out, especially on some of the longer season crops like the corn and soybeans and some of the later canola crops. But certainly on the dry side, not a lot of snow. And I know as you move west of here, much more drought-like conditions last summer, leading a lot of guys to be a bit pessimistic around yields. And then, yeah, the slide in the overall commodity price is definitely something lots of guys are talking about as they try to plan for this year.
But we got to be careful though, right? Like I've been speaking to audiences all over Canada and the US the past couple months. It's fine to be aware of the economic realities and tighter margins and adverse weather conditions, but we got to be careful. The decisions we're making don't put us actually further behind the eight ball. And I think about that from an agronomic perspective, right? Maybe making the cheaper genetic decision, or thinking about from a nutrient package, really, because it's easy to fall into this like, it's going to be a terrible year, and you start to make decisions that put yourself really behind that eight ball.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, as we see some consolidation, larger farms, right, there's that tendency to want to keep things simple. And then with that price pressure to kind of back off on our investment in those crops. And then from a crop selection standpoint, right, to try and pick what's going to be the winner and deploy it over most of those acres. And research and experience has taught us that diversity can be our friend, and those cropping mixes help us manage that risk. We often think of the agronomic benefits of that, right? And the obvious one is, things like disease, right? Blackleg and clubroot in canola, Goss's wilt in corn, fusarium head blight and leaf disease in our cereal crops. We know that a break between those host crops helps that inoculum become less viable and creates less risk for that next time we grow that crop. And so we think of the agronomic benefits, but unless you're fantastic at predicting the price trend on every crop in your cropping mix, having a diverse mix on that farm is another risk management tool, and you kind of need to look at it that way.
When you're talking to customers about that crop plan, um, you and I were talking during the commercial break about still planning for like that average yield, even when we're in drought conditions, because if we don't, even though we have had a drought bias, a significant drought bias in some of the areas of Western Canada, indeed, still planning for that average or trend line yield, because it's a trend line yield for a reason. It's because that's where we typically would end up given appropriate conditions come through, right? So you can always back off later in the season as opposed to trying to play catch up because of is that the right way to look at it, or what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that tends to be my approach is, and I especially think if you kind of look at the average over, say, the last 5 year average of that particular crop on your farm, you're incorporating some of the newer genetics you've been growing, but you're also, if the last couple of years have been down years, that's already built into that average a little bit. So you're already being a bit more conservative to
Mm.
begin with. And so, I think we need the plants need a certain level of support in terms of their plant health, right? Plants that are suffering stress from nutrient deficiencies aren't going to handle drought stress. They're not going to handle pressure from weed competition or insects or pathogens as well, right? If they can go into that situation healthy to start with, it generally helps the final outcome in the end. So, I think where I tend to look for more efficiencies is things like our fertility program, right? If you're looking at cutting back, making sure you're keeping a good balance, and that's a balance of nutrients available to the plant, whether it's coming from the fertilizer, it's coming from the soil. So, I always harp on soil testing, but a year like this, where you're coming out of maybe some abnormal growing conditions, sometimes those residual levels will surprise you, and it can be an opportunity, right? If you shot for an average to above average crop last year and didn't get it because of the drought conditions, something else limited that yield, there's potential for there to be some good residual levels in that soil. So then that becomes an opportunity to not hurt your crop, but save some money. So it's, the investment in something like a well done soil test relative to the expense of the input itself is pretty small, and it can really pay off in a year like this.
Derwyn, I wanted to wrap up with this, and that was, I was hearing a group of growers talk last week about how, it looks like we're going to be off to a bit of an early start if conditions kind of hold and this continues to follow through. We're going to be in the ground early or at the earlier part of the traditional window. Think about canola, and I think about flea beetles because we're not launching out of the ground when we're seeding canola early. What are some of the things we need to do to protect ourselves and those plants?
Well, certainly, look to those higher end seed treatments to provide us as much protection as we can. But it always is a bit of a race between the growth rate of the crop and the feeding rate of the flea beetles when it comes to that pest in particular. They can be around in pretty high numbers, and they can get pretty active depending on what the weather conditions are after that crop sneaks out of the ground. Um, so, seed treatment is one thing. The other thing, there may be a temptation to cut back on seeding rates as a cost management strategy, but plant population spreads the flea beetle population over a lot more plants per acre, right? And that means there's a better chance of that crop staying ahead of the damage they're causing, and buys us time if we need to step in with a rescue treatment. And I guess for everything else, you talked about the opportunity to cut back in season. That all stems back to effective scouting of our fields too. Weed population, weed spectrum, right? It's a good herbicide resistance management strategy to go with a combination of products in the tank. But, as a short term cost mitigation strategy, you do need to look at what spectrum of weeds are out there, and do I really need all of those herbicides in the mix, this season? So you've always got to weigh that.
Well, hey, Derwyn, thanks so much for joining us. Really, really appreciate it. Have yourself a great spring, and we'll talk to you once the crop gets in the ground.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot.